Mario is the most famous character from all of video games, and he's from where? If you listen to him speak, he has a clear Italian accent.
Mamma mia!
But the games are set not in Italy, but the Mushroom Kingdom. And while Mario, Luigi, Wario, and Waluigi all have Italian accents, Peach, Daisy, and Rosalina sound American instead.
Hi, I'm Daisy.
So, in this video, I want to explore Mario's country of origin. When did Mario turn into not just a plumber, but the Italian plumber we know and love? By reading through interviews with the very people who created Mario and the Super Mario series, let's answer the question, why does Mario sound Italian? Part 1. Mario is created. So, the story of Mario's nationality can be broken down into 4 key moments. Let's start with the first, the creation of Mario. Don't worry, I'll only focus on the key points. So, in 1980, Nintendo released the arcade game Radar Scope. In Japan, the game was a relative success, and so Nintendo's newly formed American division placed a huge order of arcade cabinets. But when those Radar Scope machines arrived in the US, the game turned out to be not especially popular with American gamers, and Nintendo of America was left with a huge surplus of arcade units just sitting in a warehouse. And so, Nintendo of Japan's president at the time, Hiroshi Yamauchi, decided that the company would develop a new game to run on that same hardware. He set up a kind of competition where Nintendo's employees could put forward their ideas for this new arcade game, which is where young employee Shigeru Miyamoto entered the picture. Miyamoto had been at Nintendo for around 3 years, and he proposed a game based on the Popeye series. President Yamauchi liked this idea and decided that Miyamoto would be in charge of designing the game to replace the failed Radar Scope. Now, as we know, the game Shigeru Miyamoto ended up designing was not Popeye, but instead, it became Donkey Kong. It's long been reported that the reason for this change was Nintendo losing the rights to the Popeye license. In fact, I said so too in an old video. But it turns out that's not quite true. Actually, it was just too hard to depict the Popeye characters using small, pixelated sprites. If Nintendo had been building a game from scratch, then perhaps they would have had more flexibility with the size of character sprites. Just a few years later, they did in fact release a Popeye arcade game. But since Nintendo's team were working within the requirements set by the Radar Scope hardware, Shigeru Miyamoto was forced to replace Popeye, Olive Oil, and Bluto with new characters of his own creation. According to Miyamoto himself, when I was younger, I used to enjoy comics, and drawing comics as well. And among the comics that I read, some were Italian comics. And if you think about it, the big nose and the moustache is not a facial feature that's characteristic of Japanese people. And so I think that my connection to those Italian comics, probably I drew on that inspiration when we first drew the character. Now, there were also technical reasons behind Miyamoto's design choices. Overalls helped separate Mario's arms from his torso, his hat meant there was no need to animate hair, and his moustache and large nose helped players read his face at a small scale. But as Miyamoto himself said, there was also a major influence of European, particularly Italian, comic book designs. It was perhaps as a result of those Western comics that Miyamoto envisaged the game as taking place in New York City, or perhaps it instead came from the influence of King Kong, famously set in the Big Apple. But while Miyamoto was responsible for Donkey Kong's setting, the same wasn't true when it came to naming the game's main character. In fact, when Donkey Kong was first released in Japan, its protagonist didn't have a set name. Miyamoto considered calling the protagonist Mr. Video, but this idea never ended up going anywhere. Japanese promotional materials for the game mention Donkey Kong by name, but Pauline is known as Lady, and Mario isn't mentioned under any name whatsoever. By the time Donkey Kong reached America, this nameless protagonist was bestowed with the name Jumpman. In fact, you can see the name Jumpman all over Donkey Kong's cabinet art. But this cabinet art was created fairly early in the process. Some time later, Nintendo's US division printed flyers to promote their new arcade game. And all over these flyers is a previously unseen name: Mario. Part 2. Mario is named. You might already be familiar with the story behind Mario's name. Around the time of Donkey Kong's arrival in the US, Nintendo of America were renting just one smallish warehouse to store their arcade machines. And this warehouse was owned by a man named Mario Segal. The story goes that one day Mario Segal burst in, demanding an overdue rent payment. And this gave Nintendo's American staff the idea for the name of Donkey Kong's main character, Mario. Now, it's clear this name came up very late in the process. Like I mentioned, the instructions and art on the Donkey Kong machines call the game's protagonist Jumpman, and only this early advertising flyer calls him Mario. But Miyamoto liked the new name a lot. He said in an interview, "I decided a solid, imposing name like Mr. Video would work best, but thinking back, I don't think I should have gone with that name. Someone at Nintendo of America actually came up with the name Mario. If he had been called Mr. Video, he might have disappeared off the face of the earth." Now, Mario is an Italian name, which certainly implies that if not Italian himself, this protagonist could have Italian heritage. It seems staff within Nintendo were divided on the matter. The creator of the NES, Masayuki Uemura, said in an interview, "The name Mario sounds Italian, but he isn't Italian. The character's Japanese." On the other hand, Miyamoto himself said, "Oh, he's got a mustache. Well, let's make him Italian." However, Miyamoto's idea of Mario's Italian roots never made it to print in Donkey Kong's promotional flyers or arcade cabinet art. All in all, it wasn't exactly clear where this character came from or what nationality he was. But in just a few more years, all of that would change. Part 3. Mario Bros. Is created. A few years after Donkey Kong's release, Shigeru Miyamoto's boss, Gunpei Yokoi, approached Miyamoto with the idea of creating a multiplayer competitive game which would eventually become Mario Bros. And according to Miyamoto, "On the way home from the office, I spied a concrete wall in a residential area which had a number of drainage pipes coming out of it. I thought, I can use those." That experience inspired the iconic pipes found in Mario Bros. And later in the wider Mario franchise. But having Mario and his brother explore a dark space with sewer pipes would lead to a jump forward in Mario's story. If Donkey Kong was set in the heights of New York City, then this new game would be set underneath the Big Apple. Specifically, Miyamoto imagined the game taking place beneath Brooklyn. This was something Miyamoto just decided for himself, but it soon formed the basis for the very first era of Mario's lore. According to Miyamoto, after the release of Super Mario Bros. In 1986, the setting of Mario and Luigi as Italian-American plumbers living in Brooklyn who were sucked into the Mushroom Kingdom became a kind of agreed-upon backstory within Nintendo, and this story was provided to the various licensees of the Mario series. That's why it crops up in all number of official licensed Mario adaptations from the 80s to the early 90s. In the Super Mario Bros. Super Show, for instance, we meet Italian-American plumbers Mario and Luigi, with the former played by iconic Italian-American wrestler Lou Albano, and watch them partake in various shenanigans in their Brooklyn plumbing business in the live-action segments. Then, in the animated segments, the brothers are sucked into the Mushroom Kingdom. Similarly, in the 1993 live-action Super Mario Bros. Film, we again meet Italian-American plumbers Mario and Luigi, who are again transported from Brooklyn to the fantasy land of the Mushroom Kingdom. Neither Bob Hoskins, who plays Mario, nor John Leguizamo, who plays Luigi, are Italian themselves, but Leguizamo, who was born in Colombia, joked, "You always see a lot of Italians playing Latin people, like Al Pacino did in Scarface. Now it's our turn." In other words, there was no mistake. By this point in time, Mario was clearly Italian through and through. But the iconic Italian Mario voice only came a few years later with the arrival of a certain iconic voice actor. Part 4. Mario, Meet Charles. So far, it was clear outside of the games that Mario and Luigi were Italian, in the movie, in TV shows, and so on. However, in the video games themselves, Mario and Luigi never spoke. On consoles like the NES or SNES, that just wasn't possible to achieve technically. But in 1990, Nintendo decided they wanted a voice for Mario, specifically for trade shows and conferences. They had the idea for something called MART, or Mario in Real Time, where an actor would be strapped into this slightly terrifying looking headset, and their movements would be tracked. The final result was a cutting-edge visualization of Mario, which matched the movements of the hidden actor. And so, the company held an audition session in California. They told auditionees nothing more than the fact they were an Italian plumber who'd have to speak to a huge number of people of all ages. In other words, one of the only pieces of information provided was Mario's nationality, Italian. And just as the audition was about to finish, a young actor burst in and begged to record for the role. This actor's name was Charles Martinet, and he would change people's image of Mario forever. Martinet chose to adopt a higher-pitched, friendly-sounding Italian accent, inspired by his time performing in Shakespeare plays.
Okie dokie, let's make a pizza pie together. You go get some sausage, I'm gonna get some spaghetti. We're gonna put the spaghetti in the sausage into the sweet pizza. Then I'm gonna chase with the pizza.
Nintendo really liked Martinet's spin on the character, and he got the gig. For the next few years, Martinet performed as part of this Mario in Real Time system across various conventions and trade shows. Plus, he appeared for the first time in a Mario video game in the 1994 release of Mario Teaches Typing.
I know you're going to be a great typist one day.
But 2 years later, Martinet's Mario voice was heard for the first time in a mainline Mario game, Super Mario 64.
It's me, Mario!
Mario's image was forever shaped by this one moment. Mario went from gaming's iconic plumber to gaming's iconic Italian plumber. And Nintendo never looked back. Thanks so much to my supporters on Patreon for helping make videos like this one possible. In particular, thanks to my top tier supporters: Alison Withernall, Brandon Pimental, Brett and Derek, Candy Crystal, Cyprian Eov, Daryl Jarrow, Ellie Birnbaum, Evan Kinney, Hi There and Bye, J.E., Jim Gilsonan, Kieran Chan, Kelly Wright, Lucas Little, Michael Gunter, Skator Pie, and Thomas Söderland.